Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Dr. Sebastian Morello. Last time we talked about the life and legacy of Sir Roger Scruton. And then even before that, we talked about creation as God's icon. And now we're going to be discussing the aesthetics of Aquinas and Sir Roger Scruton. And so obviously I have a pretty daunting task, but Dr. Morello has graciously agreed to approach it. And so Dr. Morello, thank you for coming on again. Are you doing any books or any other works in the process?
I thank you, by the way, for having me back. It's great pleasure and honor. I've got a book under review with Routledge, which I mentioned to you, I think, last time on political philosophy. So now I'm hoping that'll be out later this year. And just, I think I mentioned this to you last time. I've got a fellowship at Princeton University, which I shall take up in September. So I'm just preparing for that. In the meantime, doing quite a bit of intellectual journalism, and writing out these arguments for a popular audience, and doing a bit of editing. So that's keeping me busy and paying the bills. And I look forward to crossing the pond in a few months.
Yeah, that'll be great. If you don't mind me asking, of Sir Roger's students, or I don't know if you'd want to answer this, but of Sir Roger's students, do you feel as if you're the one that's carrying on the mantle the most, or do you feel like there are other people who are doing just as good of a job?
Well, it's difficult to say. He didn't have, among his students, he didn't have disciples. All of his students were both very keen to learn from him and also took a critical approach to his thought. Being formed before I studied with Roger, being formed in the classical realist Thomistic tradition, there were always going to be points of tension between his philosophical commitments and those that I had already developed and in large part have not abandoned. But certainly all of his students have a sense that there is something lovable about the Western intellectual tradition and about the civilization to which we are heirs, and that this great treasury, or civilizational treasury, is being undermined in the modern age. And so you might, it's rather degrading, but you might say that he formed a body of activists, because all of his students have that sense and have all decided in various ways to apply the formation that we received from him to continue that fight, as it were. And I very much see myself to be engaged in that through my writing, through my books, through my teaching, through my intellectual journalism. I know that it is fashionable among many philosophers to look down one's nose at intellectual journalism. But Roger always said, you must never stop doing that. In fact, he once said to me, even if you end up with a full chair at a top university, you must never stop doing intellectual journalism, because the guy in the pub needs to know these arguments too, and he needs to receive them in an idiom which is accessible and so on. And that's not easy to do. That's a real craft. It takes a lot of time to develop, and so there are a lot of us doing that. So no, I would prefer to say that he formed a group of people who have deeply conservative sympathies, and we're all doing our bit differently, but in a complementary way, in the hope of salvaging what we deem to be of lasting value in our culture, in our civilization. I think that's the best way to put it. And there are many of his students are doing very, very fine things, very fine things indeed. Yeah.
Well, let's begin then by just discussing what Sir Roger thought about St. Thomas and Thomism, because you briefly mentioned that you would have different basic, maybe philosophical commitments in certain areas, and you were formed in the classical Thomistic tradition. He, I think, was much more influenced by modern philosophy.
Sure.
So, what did he think about St. Thomas and Thomism?
Well, you're right. He was formed in the analytic tradition, really, very standard Cambridge University analytic philosophy. So classical realism, Thomism, even patristic thought was certainly not his school. However, it should be noted that his doctoral supervisor was Elizabeth Anscombe, who took a very serious interest in Thomism after she received her formation from Wittgenstein, and so he was definitely exposed to that thought through her. I would say that he was attentive to that tradition in pretty much all of his works, particularly his later books. He at least mentions Thomas once or twice, so he was attentive to that thought. After his analytic tradition, he sought to, if you like, give content to the style of philosophy that he had received, really by attending to German thought, Hegel, Kant. But I think he accepted that if you didn't take particularly medieval philosophy seriously, you had a major hole in your thought. And one thing I would say is that there was always going to be a tension because of his devotedness to Kant. He had anti-metaphysical prejudices. That's just a fact, and he brought those to his reading of Thomas. Also, the great contribution that Roger felt Christianity and Christian thought had brought to the wider Western tradition was that of an ordered and insightful mysticism. Roger was very devoted to the writings of John of the Cross, for example, and often he kept the poems of John of the Cross on his desk, and he thought that Aquinas and perhaps what he considered to be an excessive Latin rationalism that Thomas had brought into the Christian academy was in some way a kind of setback. It was a shame, because for Roger the real contribution was mysticism. Now, I did once point out to him that, for example, in the Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas devotes one article to proofs for the existence of God, the famous 5 ways, whereas he devotes 1,004 articles to the gifts of the Holy Ghost, the fruits of the Holy Ghost, the infused virtues, basically the transformation of human nature by grace, which is what mysticism is. So I tried to suggest to Roger that perhaps his interest in the mystical life and that great contribution from Christianity was something not at odds with Aquinas's thought, but shared. And he was rather surprised by that. But of course, I think that's because he never really attended to the primary works of Aquinas. I think he read the Prima Pars on the grounds that Wittgenstein also had, and therefore he felt that an educated man should probably read that. But yeah, I think he read a few manuals, commentary and things, but didn't attend to the primary texts, which may have led to a bit of a deficit in his knowledge of Aquinas. But I think that's all there is to say about that, really.
All right. Well, now to the topic of aesthetics, or more specifically, beauty itself. Dr. Morello, does beauty matter?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say yes, but the question is why. I mean, the first thing one can say is that beauty is something that we all naturally do. You can't really get away from it. When people purchase a home, they go and buy curtains for the home, but they're not only thinking about blocking out the light, in the morning or whatever. They're also thinking about what sort of pattern those curtains should have, what material they should be made from. They also buy pictures to put on the walls. Even if they don't do that, it's a very modern thing to have fewer pictures and to have more photographs of oneself and one's family. But even then, when people decide to have photographs, they're the most pleasing photographs. They're photographs where they're in nice clothes and they're having fun. They're smiling rather than looking angry. They're trying to clothe these images with aesthetic value, and so you can't really escape from beauty. It is something that we have a natural, prejudicial, unexamined impulse to embrace, even if we get it wrong, in fact. So that's the first thing to say about beauty. The second thing is that, and this I think will be a recurring theme in our discussion, but beauty is essential to what we mean by being a person. There's a long-standing tradition of distinguishing between the human being and the human person. Human being obviously denotes our species kind, but the human person, to be a person, is to be a unique, non-transferable, irreplaceable individual in interpersonal engagement with other persons. That's what it is to be. In fact, the term person really relates much more to a relation between human beings that only human beings and other rational creatures might be capable of. That's what we really mean by person, rather than an object in the world. And beauty is one of these doorways into the realization of person, of the person. And one reason for that, of course, is that we make things beautiful precisely because we deem ourselves accountable to other persons. When somebody visits your home, you make sure the pillows are arranged properly on the sofa, and you make sure that the baby hasn't thrown any food on the floor, and you perhaps, I don't know, put on a collared shirt or something. You do these things because what you're actually trying to do is say, it's not simply an object like myself that happens to be entering my territory. It is this person who calls me to account, whom I love, and whom I want to demonstrate is worthy, and that I'm worthy of them. That's what's kind of going on there, and we do that through the medium of beauty. And of course, this is what manners is all about. One of the reasons why you have manners occurring, and by that I don't really mean etiquette. I don't mean a code of conduct imposed from without on a people who understand that code. I mean really sensitivity to the interior disposition of another person, the capacity to adopt their perspective on the situation and on you. That's really what manners, because of course it's conceivable that there are situations in which it's necessary to violate codes of conduct precisely to uphold manners, and we do this through beauty. And of course, this is largely why we beautify chapels. We want to be. This sounds a bit bourgeois, but if one actually thinks about it, I think it's to the point. One wants to approach God with good manners, right? And that's one of the reasons why we beautify chapels, and why people of a more traditional religious bent took exception to the whitewashing of chapels in places like England, where I live. And that whitewashing of chapels arose specifically with a new understanding of how humans relate to God, which went from a interpersonal covenantal relationship to a contractual relationship. When the Puritans were whitewashing the chapels, what they were saying was, because you have declared God your or Jesus your Lord and Savior, because you've signed the dotted line, and therefore you're saved. Henceforth you're saved because you've declared him your Lord and Savior. Therefore, this is not a relationship you have to work on through manners, through piety. You've already signed the dotted line, and all of those things are now trappings. And that's not the traditional conception of how we relate to God. We relate to God through perspectival thinking, and we demonstrate that by making our religion beautiful, right? And really, what I'm trying to get at here, in perhaps a slightly long-winded way, but I think it's important to explain the point at length, because what I'm getting at here is that for these reasons, beauty gets to the heart of what it means to be a person in the world. Okay, and that's I suppose one other thing I would add to that is that humans are creatures that enjoy certain things as ends in themselves. And this is an absolutely essential part of being human, that we attend to things that are means, and those things are means to a specific end, and there are certain things that we enjoy as ends. And those things, we have to ask ourselves why we enjoy them. And even if beauty is not the answer, it's deeply connected with how we identify things as ends. And that again is unique to being a rational creature. This is why a herd of deer may look very beautiful in a landscape, but they are not stopping to admire and contemplate the landscape. That's something only the rational creature is doing. So that's one answer of why beauty definitely matters.
You know, it fascinated me when you mentioned the Puritans and the stripping of the churches, because I guess I never imagined that. Well, I think it's obvious, but you made an obvious point, profound, which is that, when you have this theory of salvation that isn't this whole kind of view of a covenantal life, and you have to, upkeep it, maintain it, of course, not by your own power, but through the power of grace. But if you just have this theory that salvation is this kind of legal decree from God, and that's the minimal requirement, so to speak, right? Then that will reflect somehow in the way that you design your chapel, right? If you have this kind of salvation minimalism, then your church will also reflect this kind of minimalism. And I guess maybe that's an explanation of the kind of iconoclast tradition in some Protestant circles. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think downstream from that is a general contractual view of how relationships function, mm-hmm. which totally dominates the modern world. You see it arise very powerfully in religion in the 16th century, and this ends up getting secularized by people like Rousseau, who see even the formation of a nation. I mean, the word itself, nation, entails or suggests being born right? Natal,
Mm-hmm.
to a people being born together. It denotes a familial bond. But for Rousseau, what you actually have is the isolated individual who makes a contract with the state. And so there is no pre-political arrangement which is formed of pieties and accountability and a moral bond. You simply have a contractual relationship of the individual with the political power. And you see this repeated down through really all of the revolutionary movements of the last 5 centuries, which is seeing all human relationships through the prism of contractual arrangements, which isn't at all how humans function. It's not how we derive meaning from the world either. But you can understand why, if that becomes the prevailing paradigm for how we understand human relatedness, beauty increasingly starts to take a less and less important role. And maybe we'll come on to this later, but eventually that becomes what we've got largely today, where art itself, which was meant to be an aesthetic achievement, art itself becomes the facilitator of overcoming ways in which this contract has been violated. So art becomes, it simply drives its meaning from social activism rather than being a source of meaning through its incarnation of the principles of beauty. That's the kind of situation you end up in eventually.
My next question is, is beauty, because I mean, you mentioned the fact that we can be wrong, right, about our aesthetic judgments, perhaps. And so my next question is beauty objective or subjective? Because sometimes when we think about, I mean, sometimes I don't know if this dichotomy really works well with beauty, right? Because there is the component of the subject and even of the object. And so, I don't know, can you help us kind of distill what's going on here?
Well, I think it's important to say both. I mean, beauty is objective and it's subjective. And look, it's clear that aesthetic judgments are not merely matters of taste. That, I think that's something that I know that's contentious, but most people would recognize that if you walk into Uffizi in Florence and you stand with somebody next to Michelangelo's David and the person says, what a load of rubbish, then most people would say, okay, that person has failed to understand what's in front of them. There's something has gone wrong here, right? They're if you like, the possibility of failing in the intentionality of your own feelings towards an object has been realized at that moment, right? That's what's happened there. And then you can have a debate about it, right? And you can say, it's very difficult to have a debate about purely matters of taste, right? If somebody says to you, strawberry jam is it's not called jam in America, what is it called? Jelly. Strawberry jelly, is disgusting, and somebody else says, well, I love it. The conversation sort of ends there because there's an assumption that you're talking about pure matters of taste. When somebody makes that kind of judgment about Michelangelo's David, it seems, and I would be surprised if you found many people who would dissent from this, it seems that it would be reasonable to respond to that with various arguments as to why the person has made the wrong judgment, right? And you might talk about the amount, the level of skill required by the executioner, by Michelangelo. You might talk about the Carrara marble itself, how it radiates through the form that's been imposed onto it. There are, you can could talk about the proportion and the human body and how it's idealized and perfected in this image. There are many things that you could say, but the point is that you are arguing for a better objective judgment in relation to this object. But also, just because aesthetic judgments are not merely matters of taste, that does not mean that the development of taste is not a prerequisite for making proper objective judgments. And that might be what the person is saying when they confront, you know, the Philistine who rejects the importance of the David. The person might be saying, you know, look, there is something wrong here, not with the image, but with the formation of your tastes. Okay, and if you think about these arguments, and if you're sensitive to these points, and if you spend enough time with it, and you make comparative judgments with other works, then you will start to walk on the path of the development of taste. And therefore, I think a consequence of that is that you will come to a different conclusion about the merits or demerits of this particular object. That, I think, is what's going on there. And that's why, you know, when people started to think very seriously about aesthetics in the 18th century, and you had people like Shaftesbury and Edmund Burke and Kant, and then the posthumous lectures of Hegel on aesthetics, they all took the development of taste very seriously. You know, the work on the Sublime and the Beautiful by Edmund Burke, the first chapter is just about the importance of cultivating taste, right? So that's the first thing to say about that. I suppose what I would say that's interesting, and I did say this would be a recurring theme, is that the kind of arguments that somebody makes when it comes to aesthetic judgments are not your classic logical syllogistic arguments. The kind of arguments that you make are really invitations to keep such and such in mind when you look at the image, to you know, look at it in this way, to consider this. You know, you're teasing out from the person different perspectival options so that the person can have a more complete vision and come to a different account. That is deeply interpersonal, right? That is saying, you have seen it in this way, but see it with me like this. And that I think is much closer to what's going on in aesthetic debates and why actually they're so difficult.
Yeah, you know, if I could use an analogy perhaps, and just let's see how well this analogy works. But, you know, when I think about like interpretation, right, you can have multiple interpretations of a single text, but there are certainly interpretations that are better than others, or some interpretations that just totally miss the mark. So, yeah. I mean, let's take the Gospels, right? Did the disciples believe that Jesus had a corporeal body? Some people will say, no, it was just a spiritual body. And then when you read the text in you know, Luke's gospel, you know, Jesus is eating fish and bread. It's like, well, no, I think we can see the intention of the author, right? We can see what they were trying to convey, such that if we really are properly understanding what we are reading, we can see the proper, let's say, semantic scope of permissible interpretations, perhaps. What are your thoughts on maybe that kind of analogy to what we're talking about, especially because you mentioned intentionality, and I thought that was very fascinating to kind of focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about the intentionality of the feelings and emotional impulses of the one who's subject to the object.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, this is a very difficult ongoing discussion that is it important that the artist is in some way intentionally present in the art, right? And this is a this is an ongoing discussion. Some people will say, no, this is absolutely unimportant. Once the work is made, the work has a life of its own and must be admired on its own merits, and what the artist was trying to do or say to us is actually irrelevant when it comes to really understanding the work itself. This has obviously become important in recent times because you know, you have someone like Eric Gill, who was considered a very great Catholic sacred artist during his lifetime. And subsequently, on the discovery of his diaries, we've found that he had extremely unsavory relationships with, you know, members of his own family and with even his pets, and so was clearly an extremely, let's say, a chaotic individual. Now, I confess, when I go into Westminster Cathedral and I see his Stations of the Cross, I have to make a bit of an effort actually to think, you know, focus on the content of the image here and not on the fact that these were the creations of a sadistic lunatic. So that is that's an ongoing discussion. The problem with emphasizing the presence of the artist in the art is also that if you go into a modern so-called art gallery today, what you will often find is, say, you'll find I don't know, a pebble or a piece or a loo roll or something like that. And then you'll have a very, very, very long description of what the artist is trying to say and the great message he has for everyone with this kind of amazing piece of genius. And of course, unless you have that, unless you have this insistence that the artist is really present in this piece of art and he's got something to say to you and you need to heed it, unless you accept that, then what you're doing is you are a ridiculous person staring at a loo roll, right? So and so emphasizing the presence of the artist in the art has got us into a situation in which we're now paying money to go and stare at loo rolls and pebbles, and that's the real problem. So I would prefer to say that here's an example of where you need the Aristotelian mean, right? You need to take the position in the middle. It is certainly of advantage to understanding a work of art to, for example, if you go and look at the works of Botticelli, there's an amazing marble relief in the Victoria and Albert Museum in Kensington in London that combines the ascension of Christ with the giving of the keys to Peter, and it combines those two scenes in one image. So as he's going up, he's sort of reaching down and handing the keys. It's an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful image. It is certainly of advantage to both understand the gospel stories and, you know, the what Christ was doing in establishing the church on the Rock of Peter and so forth, and to understand the Platonic suppositions that Botticelli had when he made this piece of art, and why he was coming from a particular philosophical background and a particular metaphysics, which explains why it's the kind of image it is and why the gospel scene is rendered in that way. That is certainly of advantage. But you also have to be able to step back and look at a piece of art as if you didn't know any of that and still be able to criticize it and talk about it. And that's, so I think it is not helpful to emphasize one too dramatically. That's what I'd say about that.
All right, so let's go to our first figure of of study, St. Thomas Aquinas. And so my question is, and this is also, I'm giving you just really big questions and, like, stepping back. So I hope you don't mind. So what is beauty according to St. Thomas Aquinas?
Well, I mean, Aquinas doesn't say a great deal about this, by the way. It was really left to his 20th century interpreters in the neo-scholastic movement to try and develop out of Thomistic metaphysics a theory of aesthetics. Certainly, Aquinas defines beauty at one point as that which inspires pleasure when apprehended. I don't think that's really a definition at all. I think that it is an invitation to think about beauty from our response to the beautiful. He does talk about beauty as a certain radiance composed of three principles: integrity, proportion, and clarity. And a lot of people, and particularly Maritain and Gilson, argued this, that these principles are the good, the one, and the true, seen through the aesthetic prism. And from that, they developed the notion, which is highly contentious among Thomists, that beauty is itself a transcendental attribute of being itself, and is convertible with goodness and unity and truth. I think one thing to say is that Aquinas has what metaphysicians have called a twofold exemplarism. So obviously, Aquinas argues that every given substance in the world is a composition of two intelligible principles, essence and existence. We don't only know what something is, but we know that something is. And once you know what something is and that something is, you have apprehended the being. Now, for Aquinas, these are not simply mental categories. These are not only logical principles, these are real principles, because obviously it's perfectly possible to conceive of an essence that is not conjoined to any act of existence, like a mythical creature. And it's also possible for things to have different essences and still exist, to the thing that we've encountered. Which all of that indicates that essence and existence are not in any given substance irreducible to each other. They don't explain the other. So they are two co-relative, complementary, but in some way opposite principles that are united in a single being. Now, for Thomas, what explains the holding in being of these two principles is that God himself has he is the exemplar in two ways, right? He is the exemplar, and by the way, just to complicate things, in God, these are not really distinct principles, because God is a simple substance, and that's why he requires no explanation himself. But we needn't worry about that at the moment. So for Aquinas, God is the exemplar of created substances in two ways. One, according to his divine mind, he has perennial perfect ideas, which are logical ideas of genera and species, but he also has ideas of individuals, right? So Suan, you are held in being, not because God simply has an idea of man, but because God has an idea of you, and his idea of you is a perfect exemplar of you. He then takes that idea of you that he has, and he conjoins it to an act of existence, and voila, there you are. But that principle of existence is itself has itself an exemplar in the divine nature. So you have the divine mind and the divine nature. Now, what the neo-scholastics of the 20th century thought was that, and I'm very sympathetic, by the way, to this view, was that what the artist is doing is a kind of Platonic assent to the divine mind of God, right? So when going back to Michelangelo's David, he isn't just giving you David. He, if you like, is giving a kind of ideal of what man is, and he's doing that because he has, in a Platonic assent, he has ascended to the divine mind, so as to contemplate the perennial idea of man, of which all men are partial instances, fragmented instances. And he has brought that idea down and he has incarnated it in marble. And he's done that through picking the right matter, and through what Aristotle called techne, this kind of prudential imposition of a new form on a matter predisposed to receive it. He has incarnated that for the contemplation of his fellow man. Now, I think there is a bit of a problem with this theory. I'm, as I say, I want to insist I'm very sympathetic to it, but I think that it doesn't help you. It doesn't get you very far. Yeah, it doesn't get you very far in relation to specific works. Okay, because one doesn't want to say, well, therefore the more abstract and the more the more, if you like, disembodied a form is imposed on matter in a given work of art, the more perfect it is, right? And it can kind of lead you down that road. And I know Maritain wanted to avoid that, and he gave many examples of the Impressionists and so on that he admired, and why you could argue for the merits of those works from a Thomistic account. But many people have felt, for example, in his works on art, art and scholasticism is obviously the more famous one, but he wrote others. Many people have felt that he does end up just kind of describing his own tastes, right? And that is a problem regarding the applicability of this account, which is why I do think that the thought of Sir Roger, which I know you want to come on to, which is why I think, surprisingly, his thought does actually complement a more classical, more metaphysical, more Platonic account. He probably wouldn't have liked to have heard that, but that's, I think that's probably true. Is that enough on that, or did you want me to say anything else about?
Well, I had one thought. I had one thought that I wanted to mention, and then we can go to Sir Roger. But on the debate on whether or not beauty is a transcendental, do you have a position?
In my first book, The World as God's Icon, I argue very forcefully in the final chapter for beauty as a transcendental, and I certainly felt that I had accumulated sufficient primary texts in Aquinas to support that, at least from a Thomistic metaphysics. I would still hold to that. Okay. The reason why I'm hesitating is that I simply don't think that the transcendental attributes of being are the best way into aesthetic judgment. And I think that if you insist on beauty as a transcendental, it's very easy to think that that's the key. And as I've continued to think about these things, I think that there are better approaches, and one is the very simple the very simple act of attending to what people do when they do beautiful things. What are people trying to accomplish? And this should get us to what it actually means to be a person. What because that's where I think you can really get to the heart of what beauty is. Beauty is intimately connected with what it is to be a person in this world. That was the only reason for my hesitation.
Right, yeah, because if we mention the transcendentals, then it could kind of get into a very heady notion of beauty, but you're very much emphasizing that beauty is something that we experience as persons, and that makes sense of us to some extent as persons.
Right. I mean, Roger always said one of the reasons why aesthetic conversations about aesthetics and conversations about art and the conversations about the role of beauty in ordinary human life, why they have become so contentious and why they so rarely go anywhere is precisely because people think that when you're trying to understand what beauty is, you should start with really big things and really great things and things that really challenge you. Okay. Prior to Hegel, this was done with landscapes. So almost all conversations and debates about aesthetics concerned natural beauty, right? That's what Burke focuses on. That's what Shaftesbury focuses on. And that's what Kant focuses on. But again, they're always dealing with, Burke's classic example of the sublime. What is it to contemplate a mountain, right? Is part of its magnificence the fact that you feel like it's going to crush you, and that is how mountains feel, by the way. I've spent a lot of time up on mountains, and they are terrifying things. And then Hegel, he wanted to recenter aesthetic debates on works of art, on human aesthetic achievements. But again, the discussions immediately get to, Botticelli's Venus, the Birth of Venus, for example, right? And Roger used to say, that painting is a painting which you could visit every day and spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours every day for the rest of your life visiting that painting, and you wouldn't get bored. It challenges the innermost being, right? It is such a remarkable work that the human spirit can't quite cope with it in many ways. And he said, so why would you start there? Why would you start at the most difficult thing? If you want to understand what beauty is, at least start with why, when children lay the table before dinner, they're careful to get the knife and the fork, not one over there and one over there, but get them aligned, and that they at least complement the knife and the fork in the next seat down, and there's some symmetry between that and the ones in front across the table, and start with that. Start with why we beautify the humdrum of everyday life, and then maybe in 30 years talk about Botticelli's Venus. And I think there's a huge amount of wisdom in that.
Well, then let's just go right into Sir Roger's conception of beauty, because I know that it's a very, very rich topic, and so I just want to let you have free reign to describe it in all of its richness.
Well, I don't. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I just don't know if I can do that. And for one reason for that is that I don't think he had a theory. And in fact, he always insisted that he had no grand theory of aesthetics. He said that he was considered an authority on aesthetics, not because he had an exhaustive account of what beauty is, but because he had been thinking about these things for long enough to be able to ask the right questions.
Mm.
That he didn't necessarily provide all the answers, but he tended to ask the right questions, which is, you know, in philosophy, asking the right questions is really the hard work, right? He certainly thought that you should not start with some abstract argument that you then try to apply to all different instances of the beautiful. I'm going to put a caveat on what I just said. One thing that you might argue is something like a grand theory of beauty was his view of homecoming. He thought that we beautify the world and we look for beauty in the world because we are we're in an ongoing struggle to make the world into a home. Mm-hmm. And that the world itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to that endeavor, even though it seems like such a humble endeavor. That's why he was very uncomfortable with what you might call revolutionary artistic acts, because in some way they seek to call into question and repudiate what people have always done to beautify the world. But actually, if you attend to what people have they've always done, and his two examples was the beauty of the ordinary, the humdrum beauty, the laying of the table, the putting on of leather shoes, you know, the decision to, I don't know, brush one's hair in the morning. It's not something I have to worry about, you know. The beauty of the humdrum and the classical vernacular were two areas that he thought one should attend to with great sensitivity. By the classical vernacular, I mean those forms, particularly in architecture, that have come down through the ages and that we repeatedly turn to in order to create a consoling environment. You know, the Corinthian pillar is just one example of, you know, it's very slender. It complements the actually many forms of architecture extremely well. The beautiful capital with the flowing, curling leaves. There is a reason why we have repeatedly turned to the Corinthian pillar when we have made great architecture in every age. Well, for him, we're trying to make a home in this way, right? And this is something to be cherished and to be understood, and that you don't stand in judgment over, but you sit at the feet of it and try to understand. And I think, interestingly enough, I've often thought about this in relation to the Dutch artist Vermeer. You know, Vermeer is a perfect example of someone who he paints in many, not always, but in many of his paintings, he paints the humdrum, right? You know, his famous image of the milkmaid, or his famous image of, you know, his famous painting, the wine glass, which is a lady sitting at a table, trying a glass of wine with a gentleman standing next to her, enjoying her enjoyment of the wine. And these are completely humdrum, everyday. This is not, you know, the famous romantic images of Napoleon on his steed or whatever. These are just completely ordinary humdrum events. And yet what Vermeer wants to do is say, look how the room is arranged. Look how the people are conducting themselves toward one another. Look how this simple little everyday gesture is actually pregnant with meaning. And that, I think, is a very good place to start. At least for Roger, that was where you started. You started with what people are doing to beautify their lives. Mm-hmm. And for him, if you want a grand, exhaustive, overarching theory, he's looking for an aesthetics of belonging. He's looking for an aesthetics of home. And that is why he felt that the modern urban environment was such a malign phenomenon, because the city itself is an extraordinary thing, right? We don't often think about this, but the congregating of people, for the congregating of people for the betterment of their lives and the lives of others, so they can be close to one another, they can call each other to account, they can trade, they can flourish together. The city is an endeavor to make a home together in this world, to cross family voids and even cultural voids, and to create a place of settlement. Old cities in Europe, places like Florence, like Siena, like Bruges, places like Cambridge or Chichester, you know, they testify to this attempt to create a place of consolation and settlement, where a very threatening and dangerous world, which seems, you know, hell-bent on spoiling that endeavor, where that can actually be achieved. And what the modern urban environment has done is, if you like, going back to the theme we touched on earlier, it has said, no, you are objects of utility in a contractual arrangement. You come into these big glass buildings which are built for this purpose, and you work, and then you go home and you go into your little square block, apartment block, like a lab rat, and you stare at a screen, and then you repeat that the next day. And this is, for Roger, these are completely you know, unhuman. This is a completely unhuman way of living, and the aesthetics, the aesthetic that we had chosen testified to that. It testified to that arrangement. Now, I think it's important here to note that the big presupposition in everything I've just said is that alienation from ourselves, and alienation from the world, and alienation from one another is our natural condition. This was something that Roger talked about more and more as time went on, and the last, in my view, his greatest books written in the last decade of his life, The Face of God and the Soul of the World, very much focus on this theme of human alienation. Obviously, this is a major theme in European philosophy, but he wanted to focus on this because he thought that aesthetic achievement wasn't something you simply fell into, right? It may be wearing leather shoes and laying the table. Maybe those things arise out of one's natural impulse to make to make your home and your immediate environment pleasant. But the creation of a city or the settlement of a nation, that's a really hard work. Okay, it's extremely hard, and it takes a very long time, and that is not something we fall into without striving, without effort. Okay, and so and maybe when we talk about Christian themes, which I hope we will towards the end of Roger's thought, maybe we'll come back to that, because increasingly towards the end of his life, he felt that the theme of alienation was something that could only really properly be expressed in theological language. But I want to go back to his aesthetic thought, because this is perhaps why he railed against what he called kitsch so much, right? Because the big difference between the beautiful and the kitsch is that when you encounter something of great beauty, you in some way forget yourself, right? You become completely intentionally present in the image, and you almost forget that you're of any importance. You're just completely immersed in the object you've encountered. This can happen with a great landscape. This can happen with a great work of art. What kitsch does is it takes your outward directed emotion and it reflects it back to you. That's why, if you like, the corollary of kitsch is sentimentalism, right? And sentimentalism is, you could say, it's self-directed emotion. Okay, and this is why, for Roger, themes of beauty and themes of holiness or the sacred were so deeply interwoven, because the holy person is the person who has died to self, right? The holy person is the one who lives in a state of self-forgetfulness. This is what, of course, John the Baptist says in John's Gospel, right? No, I must decrease, he must increase, right? This is if you like, that's the perfect summary of what the process of deification is. Okay, where this self-forgetfulness leads to a complete overflowing of oneself into Christ, and you become lost in him. And beauty is analogous to this process, right? What kitsch does is it brings you back into yourself and locks you up within yourself again, where you cannot be a person, you cannot be an interpersonal relatedness, you become an isolated shell of a creature. And he thinks that, or he thought that this was largely the modern condition, right? And you see this played out in, you know, the obsession with social media and the culture of taking selfies, and all of this is this thing of being locked up within oneself. Now, of course, there is a paradox here. Whilst beauty is meant to, in some way, lead to the forgetting of self, so too its effect is self-transformation, if you like. This is, of course, the big difference between contemplating a work of art and learning some information, right? You can do something with information. You can go away and do something with it. Whereas art is meant to do something to you. It's not something that's the relationship it has with you. So yes, I think that's something of an account of what Roger wanted to say about those things.
Right, and let's just now get into, you know, comparing these two figures, right? Because I don't know, in the original question I said overlap, but maybe overlap isn't the right word. I think you said the aspects to which, you know, Sir Roger's philosophy and St. Thomas's are maybe complementary,
right?
And so I just want you to discuss where, I guess, they're complementary and where they differ.
Yes, well, I mean, these are two very different characters, so this is not an easy task. I suppose one thing I'd say is that Roger always coupled ugliness and desecration. Now, this would obviously, what I'm about to say, presupposes the notion that beauty is a transcendental, but one of the things about desecration is that it's a privation of being rather than an adding on to, right? It's or a bringing to perfection. It's taking away something. Okay, and of course Hegel referred to this as the power of the negative in revolutionary activity, and you know, you see this in Duchamp's famous putting a moustache on Mona Lisa. Well, you could say he added something to an image, but really what he did is he just took something perfect and ruined it, right? It's like scratching at something, right? It's that sort of thing. And you see this, of course, the Chapman Brothers, who, again, in England, they famously bought first edition prints of Goya, really magnificent images, and drew clowns' faces on the images and things like that. All of this behavior is in some way to say we don't have anything to contribute of our own, but our art is to ruin the contributions of others. That's what we can do. When growing up, my parents, they felt that exposure to art and to music and to the achievements of our civilization, they felt that was important. We would go to the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery, and we would visit these places. But I would say my parents were not always, they didn't always discriminate quite in the way that I would between art forms. And so sometimes we would visit the Saatchi Gallery or the Tate Modern, and there was a general assumption that we were just looking at art from different periods of time, that you had to just assess it on the merits of its particular time in history, rather than try and make some kind of objective judgment or even comparative judgment with art of previous times. And I remember as a teenager going to see the Chapman Brothers exhibition in the Saatchi Gallery, and one of the things they had done is they had made waxwork models of children, naked children, and put genitals on their faces. Now, obviously, this is problematic from a moral perspective anyway, because it's sort of pedophilic, and it's kind of shocking that they were allowed to even exhibit that kind of material, but they could do so in the name of art, right? But the interesting thing is, okay, they had not, as in my previous examples, taken an achievement and ruined it. They had made something of their own, but really all they had done is imitated something that is beautiful, the human form, particularly the healthy child's form, and they had warped it and corrupted it in a way as to as they would probably put it, to challenge people or something like that. But all of this is a power of the negative, really. It's always desecration, warping, trying to morph into something ugly, something that will upset and so forth. This is not, if you were to hold it up against the principle that Roger employed, that art in some way is there to make a home of this world, it certainly fails in that regard, right? Now, another, I suppose, way of you could see how they complement one another. One is this idea of ugliness and desecration as a privation of something, as I mentioned. But another might be this theme of alienation. So Roger, towards the end of his life, stopped using the word alienation and used the term original sin, as he does in The Face of God and the Soul of the World. And when he used the term alienation, he makes it quite clear that he is trying to explore the same thing as theologians refer to as original sin. He says that this condition is the condition in which we find ourselves, and the kind of interpersonal relatedness required for us to be flourishing persons simply is not available to us. We don't have within ourselves the apparatus to flourish in that way as persons. And in The Face of God, he says, the conclusion to which I have reluctantly become is that this is all a work of grace. Now, again, this seems to be in some way, I wouldn't say, again, I wouldn't say complimenting, but you can find an analog in Aquinas here, right? I mean, when Aquinas talks about faith, how do we come to faith? He says that the actual articles of faith, the propositional knowledge that's revealed, those articles are not in themselves convincing, right? They don't compel assent. In fact, in some ways, they're quite unconvincing. So Thomas says, well, how is it that people who are sensible and rational come to believe? And he says the will moves the intellect. Now, there's a really bad way of understanding that. And the really bad way is the way that I was initially taught, which is that in some way, because God has revealed himself and there's a possibility that this is true, you kind of force yourself to believe because that would be the only just thing in those circumstances. That's a terrible way to believe. That's a terrible way to understand St. Thomas. What St. Thomas actually says is that God, through created means, namely grace, enters the human heart and he creates he establishes a sympathy, that's the word that's usually translated, a sympathy between the human soul and God, so that in some way, even though perhaps you don't even know that God is triune or that he incarnated to save us or any of these things, in some way, you, through this work of God in your heart, you begin to see the world from his perspective. You adopt a kind of divine perspectival knowledge, which means that when a minister of the church then starts telling you what the articles of faith are, you, instead of saying, well, that's implausible, you say, oh yeah, that does kind of sound like God, right? Well, why are you doing that? It's because there's already this co-naturality established between you and God through grace. Well, this is essentially, from a theological perspective, perspectival knowledge. That's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with the actuation of personhood in relation to God. For Roger, there's an analog of this entire account of what faith is in the aesthetic judgment. How do you come to aesthetic judgments? You see what other people are doing around you. You see how they beautify their lives. You see how you beautify your life. You see how you try and adopt the perspectives of others, how you try and live in a way that's mannered and respectful of others, that you beautify your life because you believe yourself to be accountable to others, because you see the world from their perspective. It's this perspectival knowledge that accounts for your desire to make things pleasing, to look at, to listen to. And so there, I think in both of those, well, I would also say, and this is not Roger now, I just to develop the thought for a moment, I'd also say there's an analog between what grace is doing in the human heart and what the artist is doing with a work of art, right? When God enters the human heart, he doesn't change our nature, he simply enters it from without and transforms it from within so that it becomes a new creation, right? And what is the artist doing, particularly to use the example of Michelangelo and the Carrara marble? What's he actually doing? He comes with his idea of how he's going to make this marble a new creation, and from a block it becomes something perfected, not by changing the marble into something else, but by giving it a new form. So there are these complementary ways of thinking about Aquinas's account of human transformation and what we're doing when we're thinking about art and we're making aesthetic judgments. So that's one way of approaching it. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
No, that was really good. I really enjoyed every second of it. Well, I mean, I know that you said earlier that you wanted to hit the Christian themes of Sir Roger's work, and I know you did that in this last response. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover in terms of the Christian themes in Sir Roger's work?
Well, I won't go on too long about this. I mean, in this forthcoming book that I mentioned, I try and present this at length. I suppose I would just, I would say that it's interesting. The jury has always been out as to in what way Roger was a Christian, right? That's always been up for discussion. I certainly encourage people to read The Face of God and the Soul of the World, those two works in particular, because in my view, it's hugely providential that they were published in the last decade of his life before he died, because I think they offer the explanatory tools for understanding all his other work. I think often people do not understand his political philosophy properly because they don't read those books. It's in those books that you get his anthropology. And obviously another book I would mention is his book on human nature, which again, as the name suggests, conveys his anthropological commitments. And these, although they were, his personalism was deeply influenced by, the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber and the Kantian philosopher Stephen Darwell and people like that. He was also, he read a lot of Karol Wojtyła. He was deeply influenced by the Catholic personalists, and I think increasingly he came to a view of the human person and what the human endeavor is in this world that was, let's say, if not Christian, then definitely heading in that direction. Let's put it that way. And I think this massively influenced what he came, the kind of judgments he came to at the end of his life regarding aesthetics as well, particularly this perspectival thinking. I mean, I was actually reading a quote earlier on exactly this. I'll see if I can quickly find it, because he talks about second person perspective in relation to art. Here we are. Quote, aesthetic values are intrinsic values. And when I find beauty in some object, it is because I am seeing it as an end in itself and not only as a means. And its intrinsic meaning for me is in the here and now. That way of encountering objects in the world is importantly like my way of seeing persons. When they stand before me face to face and I recognize that I'm accountable to them and they to me. In the aesthetic experience, we have something like a face-to-face encounter with the world itself and with the things that it contains. So that's from The Soul of the World, page 174. And that's a very good example of where his thought was going in the last decade of his life. Deeply personalist, and very much downstream from a Christian anthropology, I would say.
All right, Dr. Morello, here's my absolute last question. So you've kind of already talked about this before, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but what is beauty according to Dr. Sebastian Morello?
Oh, golly. Okay. Well, let me say something about the world as a place that is not obviously our home. Obviously, this is a Scrutonian theme, but I think that this is certainly a point I've been thinking about a lot recently. There's a long-standing tradition that really can be found in all cultures. It's not unique to Christianity. It can be found in the Stoics, it can be found in the Buddhist tradition, in Hinduism, which is a vision of the world as a place of struggle. It's a place of struggle and it's a place of suffering. And with the Christian deposit, we didn't get a different vision of the world. That's the world that Christianity, that's the worldview that Christianity gives us. The big difference that Christianity brought was the view that, well, the big difference was that something had happened which gave us a power to redeem this fallen world. Let's put it that way. And this is very much an Augustinian view of the world, that in some way this is a fallen, sad place. It's a place that became what it was never supposed to be through sin. And because of this intrusion of grace into the world through Christ's sacrifice, through the work of redemption, this world can reflect the heavenly realities which it is one day to become united with and embody. And so this is a Platonic view of the world, but it's also a deeply incarnational view of the world. It's the view of the world that actually gave rise to the social and political settlement that we now call Christendom. The idea that actually you can carve out a part of this valley of tears and you can transform it so that it now is no longer offensive to God, but it glorifies him in some way. And you can expand the territory of that work of redemption. Now, this to me is not entirely dissimilar to Scruton's view of homecoming, that in some way, despite this world being a world of hatred and violence and disease and all of these things, in some way it is possible to make a home out of this world. I think that Tolkien was very good in giving us an image of the Shire as a place where people are at home. By the way, Tolkien's Shire is in the midst of an extremely violent world that wants to wipe that face off wipe that home off the face of the planet, right? He doesn't deny that Middle Earth is a fallen world. It's a valley of tears, but somehow through slow, prudential, if you like, humdrum approaches to aesthetics, you can make this world into a home. And this Platonic / Augustinian view of the world has been, but I should caveat this, I had an extremely interesting conversation just the other day with Professor Thomas Pink from King's College, London. If you haven't had him on, by the way, I would strongly encourage you to get in touch with him, because he has so many fascinating things to say. But one of the things that he noted in a conversation we were having was that this Augustinian worldview has been extremely productive of aesthetic achievements, right? There is something about this worldview that gives one a sense of urgency. We must redeem this world, because if you don't redeem this world, it will swallow you up, right? And so we must strive to make it beautiful and a place of settlement, and we must do that. It's been extremely productive of great achievements, works of art. So too, the loss of this Augustinian worldview has brought about serious adverse effects when it comes to the artistic enterprise. And this has been seen very much in the last half century in the Catholic Church, where increasingly this old Augustinian view of the world as the principality of Satan, which is a dangerous and fallen place where there are malign forces that want to do you damage, and that you are engaged in a fight against this to make things sacred and beautiful and holy and a place of home that can glorify God. That was replaced with a view that actually the world isn't such a bad place after all, and we should open up to the world. The world is a place that is redeemed by nature rather than by grace. And one of the immediate effects was this was a complete collapse in the artistic endeavors of the Christian world. So there is I think an important connection there. And of course, one of the things that this all implies is that the great servant of the religious endeavor is art. That is the great servant of the religious endeavor. One of the things that Roger used to say is that since the 18th century, the late 18th century, we have asked far too much of art. You know, there was this view that religion is on its way out. We need to order our lives towards some end, which is an end in itself. And since we're losing religion, which always played that role, we can pick art, and art can do that, and art will save us. And of course, very quickly we just stopped producing anything that those people would ever have described as art. And we asked way too much of art, and I would tend to agree with that view. Art can never be the replacement of the religious endeavor, because its role is to be its servant. And that's what we saw. You know, we saw that Augustinian vision realized in the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe and the great Romanesque basilicas. We saw it reasserted through Baroque culture in the 16th century. And the loss of that essential vision of essentially the world as an ongoing conflict between what is holy and therefore beautiful and what is diabolical and therefore ugly. The loss of that vision has really made the Western artistic enterprise rather impotent. I suppose I just want to, because I don't want to be misunderstood, I should say something about that having such a strongly religious view of the role of art in a purposive, meaningful human life does not in any way suggest that art should only be explicitly religious or sacred or pious. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. And in fact, it was the Western tradition of aesthetics which developed this secular artistic genre, precisely because in the Augustinian vision, the secular has been sanctified. We tend to think of the secular as the non-religious, but for Augustine, it's the temporal world brought into the realm of the holy, right? So when you look at, I don't know, the Hunters in the Snow by Peter Bruegel the Elder, which is completely it's not explicitly religious in any way, but he is working from a religious understanding of what the temporal sphere is. So he's taken a snapshot of an everyday humdrum reality, and he has shown it to be pregnant with meaning and importance because he sees hunters coming back from a hunt in the snow as an event taking place in a purposive universe. It's a purposive universe because everything is going through this drama of sanctification and struggle. And again, this is, to go back to Vermeer, this is exactly what he was doing. You know, Vermeer had this famously dramatic conversion to Catholicism. He only painted one explicitly religious image that I know of, the Allegory of Faith, which I actually think is one of his poorest paintings, as it happens. Vermeer specialized in taking the everyday mundane moment and showing it to be actually, if you attend to it and you say, wait, step back, take a moment, reflect on what's going on here. This is an event that fits into a much wider complexus of a purposive universe which is engaged in an ongoing struggle of redemption and homecoming. And that's one of the great achievements of Vermeer. And I think that this worldview, here's a positive note. I think this worldview, this Augustinian worldview, is coming back. People are discussing it again. People are thinking more seriously about it again. And I think they're doing that because this view that we have to make a home for ourselves in a valley of tears was caricatured by the ideologies of the 18th century. And liberalism and fascism and socialism and communism, they all said, yes, we're trying to make a home in this world as well, but we're going to do it through utopian ideologies. And we're going to do it ultimately, particularly in the case of liberalism, we're going to do it through the unfettering of insatiable appetite, and we're going to free you that way. And when you suffer, we'll sort that out through technology. And that whole project, I think, people are increasingly recognizing has failed. And so there's a great revisionist movement going on at the moment, which is trying to retrieve a more traditional Augustinian vision of the world, which which if that's right, if that is going on, and if that is on the rise, and people think more in terms of that worldview on which our whole civilization was built in the first instance, then we can reasonably expect the consequences of that to be a return of some serious artistic achievements, particularly if my friend Tom Pink's assessment is correct. So there's a positive note to end on.
Dr. Morello, I enjoyed every second of this, and I was smiling so much. I hope I didn't express amusement, but actually joy at listening to just, I don't know, over the years, like I've just fallen deeper and deeper in love with the study of beauty and beauty itself. And so, yeah. I mean, that played a huge part of my conversion to Catholicism, and especially like, this idea of homecoming. People talk about how, Christians, like for me, people are saying like, oh yeah, Swan, come home to Rome. Right. And I thought more about homecoming and how Christ really did carve out a church and a place for me to belong in, a whole tradition, a whole communion of saints, a whole family on this earth, but also in heaven, and, those and the church suffering in purgatory. But there's this whole transcendent family that I have, and the art of the Catholic Church was conveying that and trying to, help me ascend to that reality that I sometimes struggled to see. And then from ascending to that reality, in the beautiful sacrifice of Mass, and then going out into the everyday world. I sometimes when I'm driving down the street with my friends, I'll be a little annoyed that everybody's just like talking to each other in the car, right? And there's a beautiful pink sunset outside and nobody's noticing it. I'm like, I'm sure everybody else is just like, yeah, it's just a sunset. But for me, it's like, no, like if that's a reflection of the divine essence, then imagine what it's going to be like to be face to face with God. Oh man, so that's all I got to say there. But Dr. Morello, thank you so much for coming on to my show. And I think I'll reach out to Dr. Thomas Pink and get him on.
Yeah, do. And hey, thanks for having me on again. It's been a real pleasure.